Structural foundations for growth have been weakened. That is a matter of concern. We have to do something different. The majority of the poor are in middle-income countries. We have 3 poverty lines. If we take the upper middle-income poverty line, 47% of the global population would be considered poor. Human capital is a fundamental and essential input into the process of long-term growth. Welcome to this session. I want to really thank the conference organizer, Professor Nadim Ul-Haq, and our team here in Pakistan, our World Bank team for, first for the great idea of being part of this conversation, as it has become a tradition, and for the idea of actually inviting me to be part of this. And I'm here also with my colleague Jimena Del Carpio, the manager who came from Bangkok. Our team based in Washington and Pakistan the team is here to learn from the conference, to hear from you, so we can do better what Pakistan needs the World Bank to do. So thank you very much. It's a privilege to be part of this conference. If the talk is not of the quality you expect, you can blame it on the jet lag or the great lunch that we just had. So the blood is not flowing. But I'll do my best to contribute to the conversation that started this morning. And that is, I think, a fascinating conversation, for which I would like to bring now first sort of a global perspective and then eventually land into more specific issues related to Pakistan, and also close with a bit of an unusual part of the conversation, which is more related to governance and some of the aspects that are involved in the policy-making process that may be also at the core of potential solutions for the challenges that we face. I think one important aspect we have seen after a series of shocks and global uncertainty is that the foundations, the structural foundations for growth have been weakened, and we foresee a global slowdown in terms of growth. That is a matter of concern. You see on the left, you see the 2 negative bars are the shocks. First, the 2009 financial crisis, and of course, even a bigger impact, the COVID crisis, then the recovery. And you see the forecasts also by different groups of countries. And what we see is that there is a structurally lower level of growth. This is very important because growth continues to be a first-order concern if we are going to be addressing the issues related to improving the lives of particularly those at the bottom of the distribution. You know that in 2015, 193 countries signed a document in which they committed to a specific agenda that includes 17 goals. One of them, is not just by coincidence that the first one, in which everybody agreed to pursue, was the elimination of poverty globally. So SDG 1 is the reduction of poverty globally, which has been also, by the way, the commitment of the bank for decades now. One of the main goals, and as you know, it was recently strengthened, the mission of the bank with the new leadership, in which now our mission statement establishes that we are committed to the eradication of poverty on a livable planet, in the sense of addressing also issues related to global public goods, including climate, including fragility, including migration, pandemics, and others. But the bottom line here is that 193 sovereign countries, which is very important. This is not a UN agenda. This is an agenda agreed on by sovereign countries that got together and signed this document. And the first objective was to eliminate poverty. If we look at the left side, we can see that in the last 50 years, the world, and this is also important to establish, that the world has achieved a lot in terms of lifting poverty out, lifting people out of poverty. More than 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty, which is something we have to start by acknowledging. But we also see that if we continue the business as usual, on the right-hand side, you see the projection after the COVID shock. And you can see that right now, the elimination of poverty as agreed in SDG 1 is basically out of reach. So we have to do something different if we want to achieve that goal. So growth is now slower. Poverty reduction has this potential challenge of not being able to reach the SDG 1. So we are concerned about what do we have to do different, right? On the other hand, the complexity of addressing this challenge also relates to very context-specific characteristics. We see, for example, here that as of today, which is the vertical line that you can see for 2023, shows that the majority of the poor are in middle-income countries. That is going to change, of course, over time, related to forecasts of growth and also forecasts of population growth. But if we want to address the issue of poverty eradication, we really need to be concerned about what is happening in middle-income countries, not only in low-income countries. In the case of Pakistan, and you saw this morning, one of the features that were presented is the volatility of growth. So here you see on the left side, you see how Pakistan has lagged behind in terms of income, but also you see on the right-hand side that it's not only the income but the volatility, and you can see towards the end, the yellow bars, you can see how poverty increase mirrors the trajectory in terms of income. So contractions lead to increases in poverty. And in this case, you can see the level of poverty at $3.65 per capita per day. Very important, just as an aside, that in the World Bank, we have 3 poverty lines for the sake of international comparison and global monitoring of poverty, which is a mandate we have. The extreme poverty line is for low-income countries is $2.15 per capita per day in adjusted PPP, purchasing power parity. Then there is a line for lower middle-income countries, which is $3.65, which is the one I'm using here, and we have one for upper middle-income countries, which is $6.85 per capita per day. And if you take that poverty line, which is $6.85, which is not a very high standard, 47% of the world population is under that level. So if we take the upper middle-income poverty line, 47% of the global population would be considered poor. That again reinforces the message that growth is a first-order priority. Okay. So why do we care about equity in a broader sense? So in an academic conference, we can always refer to these seminal or path-breaking contributions. We, for a long time, understood economic growth based on a factor accumulation model a la Robert Solow. You may remember a paper in 1988 by Robert Lucas called On the Mechanics of Economic Development. Starting there is a whole new literature on the process of development, looking at the externalities generated by human capital. And precisely because of those externalities and the idea of how growth can grow geometrically once you have these externalities created by human capital, the idea that market solutions are not necessarily optimal and so on, but we see that human capital is a fundamental and essential input into the process of long-term growth. So if we want to see what are the prospects of economic development starting from a process of growth in a country, we want to look at an index of human capital, which is something we present at the bank. And if you take that human capital index, Pakistan is lower than the South Asia average and is similar to the level of sub-Saharan Africa. So definitely, if we want to look at one structural, indicator of long-term potential, this is a matter of concern, right? So we do care about this type of structural indicators. If we look at a broader definition of poverty more from a multidimensional perspective, we know that monetary poverty does not exhaust our understanding of these phenomena of poverty. So just take the Human Development Index, which is an imperfect but useful indicator of multidimensional poverty that considers issues related to education, to health, and income. We see that you see the dots for the case of Pakistan, an increase at the beginning, but then basically either stagnated or even worsened. So we are concerned about these trends. And we want to understand how we can address these long-term challenges, not only in Pakistan, but of course, in this case, we would like to discuss the case of Pakistan. Again, this is not changing the slides. Thank you. The other important aspect is that these averages hide, or well, let's use that term, hide heterogeneity, particularly across income groups, but also across space. One particular aspect that we care about is the difference between rural and urban, right? You see here the comparison for a few countries. You see that in Pakistan, the gap between rural and urban is quite considerable, right? It's a high gap. So this is important because there has been a very rapid process of urbanization, right? So poverty, even though poverty is lower in the urban context, the amount of people in the urban context is larger. So in that sense, there is a very serious concentration or agglomeration of poor people in urban sectors, right? Paul Romer, another, one Nobel Prize economist and a contributor to all the theory of economic growth, has explained this issue of agglomeration and urbanization, saying that agglomeration increases the variance of what can happen, right? So governing agglomeration is about reducing the probability of bad things happening, like crime, like segregation, and increasing the likelihood of good things happening, like learning from others, like productivity clusters and so on that were actually mentioned this morning. So as we move into more urbanized societies, the type of policies that we need may differ from those that we look at in the rural sector, in which our emphasis should be in increasing productivity, as this becomes a sector that basically is sending people out that have to be absorbed in different, hopefully higher productivity activities, okay? At the same time, if there is something we have become more conscious of recently because of the recent series of shocks that we have faced, is that people are very vulnerable to shocks, right? So in that sense, why it is important? This is important because the process of sustained poverty reduction is not, certainly not monotonic, certainly not linear, but also non-monotonic. So there can be reversals, right? And what we call resilience, which has become so important in the way we understand development, as you see in this graph, is precisely the capacity to go back to the previous trajectory once you are hit by a shock, right? So resilience comes from Latin resiliere, which means jumping back. So the idea is you are in a a specific trajectory, you get a shock, you are derailed, and the idea, your resilience means basically how fast you can go back to the previous path. By the way, a path that is typically in the economic literature measured in flows. And in a minute, I'm going to go back to this. What do we mean by flows? It's either income or consumption, for example, which are flows. But sometimes what you do is that you deplete stocks in order to be resilient when you measure it in terms of flows, right? So you, for example, you stop investing in, say, human capital, you withdraw children from school in order to generate income and being able to be resilient in terms of consumption. But now, as we know, we do care about what happens to stocks as well. So I will come back to that. But basically, as you have, systematically faced in Pakistan, the amount of people exposed to certain types of climate-related shocks like floods are systematically affecting those who are poorer in terms of the income distribution. So up to here is a little bit of the characterization of the challenges we face, right? We face a challenge of slower growth. We face a challenge of not being able to reach our objective of poverty reduction, not only from the monetary perspective, but also from a multidimensional perspective, and the idea that we really have to be protected against shocks. So all these aspects are sort of the objectives that we have to work on. And in order to do that, we need to understand a little bit more structurally what is behind the process of income generation by households. So typically what we do in our teams in the poverty and equity practice at the World Bank is to try to, we typically show this type of indicator, right? So you see what is the World Bank saying about what is the share of population who are poor. You think about what is the Gini index to measure inequality. We think about what we call shared prosperity, which is an indicator of growth at the bottom of the distribution, or just average growth, which is GDP. So all these are different indicators that are really trying to approximate something we care about, which is the incidence of growth. If you order people, if you order households from the lowest in terms of income, so from the poorest to the least poor on the right-hand side, so you divide this in 10% groups, which we call deciles, you can see what is the growth of income for every group in that order, right? So if you find, you can see, for example, here, that from 2000 to 2010, the blue line, income growth was favoring those more at the bottom of the distribution, right? And that changed. By 2010, 15, and 15 onwards, you can see that those at the bottom were not really the ones with a higher level of income growth, so that pattern was changing. Let's look at South Asia, for example, and you can see that over time from 2000, 2010, 2010, 15, and 15 onwards until right before COVID, the pattern was pretty flat. So we care about two things with these growth incidence curves. One is the level, right? Because the level tells you how much or how fast you are growing. But we also care about the shape. If you have a negatively sloped line, it means that growth is being more favorable for those at the bottom. If that line is upward sloping, then growth is being higher for those at the top of the income distribution, okay? Of course, that has implications for the indicators we just saw before. That has indicators for changes in poverty, that has implications, for changes in inequality, okay? So let's see what happened in Pakistan, and we see here that from 2010, the level was at about between 3 and 4%, but the important thing is that the pattern was pretty flat with a slightly benefit from those at the bottom, right? But that changed to an upward sloping in 2010, 2015, which is basically that started favoring more those at the top. And eventually we care about the pattern at the bottom, which is a relatively progressive pattern. But what we are concerned about is a shift downwards, which means independently of the pattern of who was benefiting more or less, the whole economy was growing at a slower rate, right? So our job as poverty and equity economists at the World Bank and to try to contribute to the dialogue in terms of policy, what we try to do is try to understand what is generating these patterns, okay? So we take the data, we go to look at households' characteristics and income generation capacity, and we see, well, what is happening that those at the bottom are generating income through certain means and those at the top in a different way. Why? Because at the end we care about what we call, different concepts of what we can call equity. If you look at the left image here, what we call it reality, some people cannot actually even watch the game. By the way, I know I can say that that's a cricket game because I don't know what is the shape. But let's call it a cricket game. But some of them cannot even watch what is happening because some of them are really, really tall in terms of their, based on their assets, their stocks, and so on, and others cannot really watch. Then equality would mean that we give the same amount, or in this case, the same support to all of them. So you can have the second one, but you still see that some of them cannot watch the game, even though you gave the same support to all of them, right? Why? Because there is a heterogeneous population there. The third one is equity, which basically means you bring everybody to the same level by providing differentiated support so they can all watch the game. But actually, ideally, what we can aspire to, and we can say, well, there are many different theories of justice, but we can say, well, we remove the wall and they can actually eventually participate in the game, right? So this is, the different aspects of what we care about. So that is why as I move into, for example, the analysis of fiscal incidence, you will see why we care about differentiated interventions because we start from a heterogeneous population, okay? So how do we design more equitable reforms? The first thing we have to think about, and this is very important, is that social transfers, social protection systems that provide insurance, so either insurance or assistance, understood as, for example, cash transfers, are instruments to temporarily relieve the situation of hardship for people, but they are not poverty reduction strategies in the long term. What we care about is about making the people at the bottom more productive, being able to generate their own income, right? So only by lifting the constraints on the productive capacity of the poor is that we can achieve sustained poverty reduction, okay? And for this, we have a very simple framework, and we look at the different type of assets that people have. Typically, you look at human capital. I already talked about human capital, which is basically education and health, and that makes people productive, and then allows them to be part of the economic process and allow them to generate income. But there are other types of capital, right? Physical capital, such as land or infrastructure, housing, financial capital, how we include people in the financial system, natural capital, which becomes fundamental if we want to have sustainability, and social capital, because we also know that social cohesion, social networks matter for people, also from an economic perspective, not only from a normative perspective. So we need to look at all these types of different assets that people have and how intensively they use them, what are the returns to that capital. Then, if we look at this carefully throughout the income distribution, potentially we can understand what is generating this pattern that you see there, okay? So finally, once people, the process of economic growth happens, and I will have a final word on that in a minute, then you can see that taxes and transfers, so the intervention of the government reshapes that pattern, right? So you can see that if there's a system of taxes and transfers that is going to be on top of the process of autonomous income generation, and that is going to reshape that pattern. So this is what the way we approach the analysis of sustained poverty reduction, by looking at this, okay? And again, I insist, because this was mentioned in the morning, the system of transfers and taxes is only one instrument, and that can be used under specific circumstances. What we really care about structurally is the capacity of the poor to generate income. Why? Because, as we want to establish very clearly, distribution and growth are not separate processes. Income distribution and economic growth are jointly determined, right? Why? Because at the end, the process of economic growth is the summing up of the contributions of different groups to that process of economic growth. So if we care about growth, but we also care about equity, we need to understand this joint process of the income generation of the different groups in the population. And then we have instruments to intervene. I will mention a few in a minute. We have fiscal policy. We have the design of institutional and public goods. We have risk management and insurance mechanisms. And we have to make sure that markets function well. Yesterday, we were, for example, talking to rural producers, and it was super interesting to hear the stories about, for example, middlemen that would come to buy the produce to take it to the large distributors, and the fact that sometimes they didn't have a lot of options to bargain because there were very few middlemen, and they would take all the surplus out of that production, right? So this is a market that, in principle, should be more competitive. So if we believe in competition, we have to really care about who is taking advantage by protecting certain markets or preventing markets from being competitive, or through, for example, trade restrictions and so on. I come from a region, Latin America and the Caribbean, that made a terrible mistake in the 60s of choosing a development strategy that was inward-oriented, closing the economies, and that eventually, a few decades later, showed, market distorted, rent-seeking, capture, and a very slow-down process of economic growth. But taxes and subsidies have to be used carefully. First, because we care about how much impact they have on the distribution, but also it's very important to see how you are affecting different groups of the population, affecting or benefiting. So if you see, for example, here by level of income, you see that in high-income countries, what you have here is, on the left, you have what we call consumable income. So the final income you take to the supermarket, let's say, or to the store, whereas on the horizontal axis, you have market income, which is what you generated in the market. So the difference between these two, roughly speaking, summarizing, is the process of taxes and transfers that take place, right? So you see that in high-income countries, actually those at the bottom are more benefited by the process of taxes and transfers. And as you move move towards lower-income countries, the system is less effective in bringing higher income for those at the bottom. And actually, they are not, helped, let's say, by the system in the same way that they are in high-income countries. So that is pretty much what we call incidence analysis, right? So look at this also by different groups of countries. If you see, basically, you start from market income, and there are different processes, you basically taxes, transfers, in-kind transfers. So you eventually get to that ex-post level of inequality. These dots are Gini coefficients, market income, and then after the intervention of government, how you end up with a Gini coefficient. And you can see that the flatter that line, the less impact you have on distribution through the fiscal system. So you see that in OECD countries, it's a very almost a vertical line, which basically means that there is a large redistribution between market income and after all the interventions, whereas in low-income countries actually it's pretty flat. So you have relatively low impact on the final Gini through the intervention of government, so you are being less effective in that capacity to redistribute. And then you also have to be careful, and this is important because the type of taxes you use can have, depending on the composition of how much of that goes, for example, of your income goes to consumption, which is typically just by Engels' law, those at the bottom, higher level of higher share of their income goes to consumption. So if your taxes are mainly based on consumption taxes, you are going to be affecting more those at the bottom, right? So direct transfers, indirect taxes are basically consumption taxes, and you see the net impact, and you see that in Pakistan actually the impact is negative, and it is actually not progressive. Okay, so we care about how the government intervenes because of all these aspects that I just mentioned. And the idea is that the system should, a socially desirable, fiscally sustainable system should encourage virtuous cycles in the sense of being, I could say, efficient and growth-friendly in a way. And just one word on CCTs. CCTs is the acronym for what is called conditional cash transfers that became very popular at the beginning of this century in developing countries as a means of redistribution, right? And that's why sometimes we mistakenly associate poverty reduction programs with cash transfers. Poverty reduction programs that lead to sustained reduction of poverty have to be those that lift the constraints on the poor to contribute more actively to economic growth. Transfers can be a temporary solution for emergency or for those who don't have the capacity to generate income. It's about social assistance. What happened is that there was one or two programs, Brazil and Mexico, in which the transfer was linked to a conditionality that would give incentives for households to invest in assets. So I give you a transfer to solve the temporary shortage in terms of income, but you commit, or it's conditional on the fact that you invest in the productive capacity of the next generation, education, health, and so on, right? So that was the original the design of these conditional cash transfers. Eventually, the conditionality was being removed. And there were even academic papers saying, no, it's not efficient. The administrative cost of monitoring and so on is too high. Let's just give the transfer. And we ended up with this crazy idea of the universal basic income, right? So it's just like give cash transfers to everybody, unconditional. So that was a distortion of the original idea, which was relieve the immediate needs by conditioning on investment for productivity in the future, okay? So the idea of productive capacity of the poor was there originally, and then became only about transfers. So I would insist on that notion. Then the idea is to try to eliminate, to the extent possible, inefficient expenditures that go, for example, to generalized subsidies, and I will show some evidence of this in a minute, of the regressivity potentially of those instruments, and think of what kind of taxes you rely on, so you make sure that if there is an impact on those at the bottom, you can compensate through specific spending, right? So the fiscal priorities, and certainly I would argue these should be priorities in the case of Pakistan, is reorientation of spending from subsidies to targeted transfers, mobilizing domestic resources without increasing poverty in the short run, and especially for the poor, investing in the productive capacity of the future. We saw the human capital index previously. There is one thing that I want to mention because it has to do with the discussion this morning. It is really, really important to challenge all these ideas that we are presenting. It's very important. We learn, we improve them, we fine-tune them. What is not possible, if we're intellectually honest, is to deny facts. We cannot have alternative facts. We know, for example, that countries whose tax collection is above 20% of GDP never rely on foreign aid. They don't have to rely on foreign aid, right? So one way to break chains with respect to foreign aid, just an idea, could be to collect taxes. If you reach a certain level of tax collection, then you break the chains to foreign aid. I come again from a region, and that's why I talk from my own experience, in which the argument was always, why do we generate more, why would we charge more taxes if the government is very inefficient in spending or it's corrupt and so on? Well, two wrongs don't make a right. Right? If you address the problem of governance and raise more taxes, or actually if you raise more taxes, people who have even higher interest in making public officials accountable on the resources they manage. So that's one discussion that I think is really important for the case of Pakistan. So just to show here that in general, generalized subsidies, by this what we mean is subsidies that reduce the price for all the consumers and compensate potential losses for producers, but it's done through lowering prices and not through direct transfers of income, tend to be to benefit those that are not necessarily the poor, right? So you see here the lighter part of the bar, which is the subsidies, that a large chunk of the subsidies go to those that are not necessarily at the bottom of the distribution, whereas with the direct transfers you can have a more carefully designed progressivity, so you can actually reach those that are really the ones that were the initial objective. There are many reasons why there could be generalized subsidies, and it's not easy to remove them, but the fact, again, the fact that cannot be denied is that they are less progressive, and a lot of resources end up going to those who are not the most in need. I think I have gone a long way. Let me try to come to a final point on policy design and governance, because I think I'm already a bit out of time. So in 2017, the World Bank produced a report on governance and the law. And the idea was to try to understand the microeconomics of why policies fail by looking at how power is delegated and exercised, right? And a very important aspect of governance, and that's why I have this quote by Albert Hirschman, is that redistribution is a constant, development is very uneven, and there are constant demands for redistribution that have to be solved. So conflict is inherent to any economic development. What differentiates countries is how you process that conflict. And that conflict can lead to inefficiency or even to violence in some cases, or can lead to a peaceful and constructive resolution of that conflict. So in the long term, that is what really matters. And that is defined or settled in what we call the policy arena. So there are actors who define policies and rules, and that has an impact on the process. So once the policies are defined, that has an impact on the growth pattern. Think of the growth incidence that I showed before. So part of the shape of that growth incidence depends on what policies you have originally designed in that policy arena, right? In which it's not only about public officials designing that, it's about many actors. If the process concentrates income in this outcome game, you actually are redistributing de facto power. So the idea is to look at how power can get in the way of effective policies. That's the idea of the report. We used to say, when we presented that report, that we were talking among, economists, and we economists are When we talk about economists are a group for whom, if you talk about power, we can only think of electricity. So we are not used to understand the concept of power and how it affects the process of economic development. So that report in 2017 was trying to come up with some ideas in terms of how the microeconomics of power, the exercise of power, can affect the effectiveness of policies, right? So you distribute the factor power, of course, those people who are benefiting from the process of growth are going to have more influence in that policy arena, and they will continue to create distorted policies. And you get trapped in that, which is very well described in Asimov and Robinson's extractive equilibrium, right? But that policy arena also can change the rules. So if you change the rules, meaning the law, you can also redistribute the jure power. And in that sense, you perpetuate those power asymmetries. So development is about market failures, about information asymmetries, but also about power asymmetries that are manifested in that policy arena, in which rules, policies, and actors matter and can lead to distortions like these three that we analyzed very carefully in that report, which is exclusion. Some people are just left out of that policy arena and then also of the benefit of policies. Capture, which is the second example here, in which basically, clientelism is the second example here, in which what you have is not that the politician is accountable to the citizens, but actually the citizens become dependent on the politician, for example, by these clientelistic policies for transfers. Or the third effect, which is the capture, in which you can see that some of the citizens there are bigger. So if I contribute to political campaigns, then the officials become more respondent to me and not to the rest of the citizens. So we need to try to impact that to generate legitimacy in the system. Legitimacy is sort of the condition of the body, and trust is sort of the temperature. So low trust is the equivalent of high temperature, which shows you that there is a problem of legitimacy, right? And you generate legitimacy by delivering to the people or by creating processes that are inclusive. One final point that I really want to make before I close, let's divide the game of policymaking into three groups. So you have a group that we call elites, and recently, PIDE had recently a panel that you called "Are Elites So Bad?" No, or it was a title like that. So we define elites not as something normatively good or bad. Just elites are people who are closer to the decision-making process. Okay. Citizens, which are outside that immediate interaction with the policymakers, can affect through either peaceful mobilization or voting. And finally, you have us, international actors, very carefully discussed this morning in terms of our role. And so there is one point, and with this I close. There are people who have analyzed ODA, over foreign aid and the impact of aid. And I have seen many papers with cross-country regressions looking at the effect of foreign aid. And they tell you, on average it's positive, it's negative, and so on. Completely meaningless. Nobody cares about the average effect of foreign aid in a cross-country regression. What we care about is how the different instruments used by the international community can affect the power relationships in a specific domestic context. So let me define one concept. In the same way that we have market failures or government failures, let me call something a development assistance failure. A development assistance failure, looking at that graph, is a situation in which, through the use of your instruments, lending, technical assistance, advocacy, through the use of your instruments, you reinforce an equilibrium that led to the outcome you wanted to change. If you are reinforcing the power balance that led to the bad outcome, then you are not contributing to change, right? At the end, change can only come from a new agreement among domestic actors. Change cannot be imported from abroad. And our role as international actors is to use the instruments we have to do it in a competitively neutral way with the local actors and try to rebalance the power asymmetries so that the policy arena is more contestable, more inclusive, and that potentially can lead to better outcomes. But just to close, do not expect that external actors are going to bring fully packaged solutions for domestic problems. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you, sir. That was very interesting analysis. On my part, I was thinking that thinking that in this globalized world, the slogan of globalization counts that subsidy is being given more and more in the developed economy that are based on especially agriculture sector. Now that you talk that subsidy is not giving any particularly very reasonable amount, it is benefiting to the poor. It is benefiting to non-poor too. Disproportionately, you said. So do you think that we should curtail the subsidies, or we should increase the subsidies, or there should be some alternative of subsidy that can support Pakistan agriculture sector, which is going in the backdrop? And we know that without developing the agriculture sector, we cannot develop. I think so, because this is the backbone of the economy. And in this globalized world, how can we refrain from the subsidies? Please.
So, first part of the answer is we try to provide facts and empirical regularities and elements for what should be finally a local discussion, right? So we can have a perspective from the international experience, from what happens in other countries, and from facts that we can come from careful analysis. So the facts are subsidies are less progressive and can be very regressive in the sense that they really go, a lot of that goes to those who are not necessarily the poorest. Second, depending on market structure, the incidence of that subsidy can generate rents for producers and never get to consumers, right? And third is that they become very persistent over time and very difficult to remove, creating a lot of fiscal, a huge fiscal burden. So those are facts, and you can go international evidence and so on. Then the discussion is, our position is, those who have managed to move in the other direction and move into more targeted subsidies generate more fiscal space, reduce the capacity to extract rents in non-well-functioning markets, and actually, by the way, if they are related to energy or fossil fuels, they also have positive impact on environmental pressures, right? So that is the position, but at the end, all these should be a sovereign discussion using those facts as inputs. No?
Thank you. Very interesting lecture. I just have two questions, quick questions. One, the statistics that you showed in terms of rural and urban divide. Now, I just want to clarify that in Pakistan, the issue with this thing is that the urban and the rural populations, actually they are based on administrative boundaries, administratively drawn boundaries. So have you taken that fact? Because if that is, if you don't take into account the administrative boundaries and take other measures of, for example, urbanity. So very little of Pakistan is now rural. So have you taken that into account, or have you based those calculations on those administrative boundaries? The second one, and the very interesting one, is your the graph that you showed, not the graph, but kind of the picture that you showed, that you make some classes more powerful and try so that they can bargain their way and maybe attain a bigger social envelope or bigger have their social say. So what's the best way of doing it? Because you talked about transfers, right? And targeted transfer. Is it the government that should get directly involved in, and it has been doing it in Pakistan, in terms of direct transfers in like programs, BISP and others? Or is it, or is it the other way? Should the government concentrate upon making markets more efficient so that it can create more opportunities for employment and other things so that people can have this way and more opportunities? Thank you.
So on the first question, and on this I will ask you also to follow up with the team, but my understanding is that indeed there is a discussion about what is the definition of rural and urban in the case of Pakistan, and there is some persistence in the definition based on these political boundaries. I think this is more of an economic definition of rural and urban, and if you take that, the level of urbanization will be much higher than the one actually reported precisely because of what you mentioned. On the second one, I think there are two instruments that should go together in principle. One is using regulatory mechanisms. It's a more complicated issue, but also trade exposure and potentially trade protection, whether in case that's on the table for discussion. But all the elements that prevent competition from being more intense in markets as a way to reduce the market power of certain actors. So that already helps. We have very clear evidence, by the way, that shows that market power also has very regressive impact. But the second is the best use of public resources in terms of going to these generalized subsidies could be to invest, as we mentioned, in the potential, in the economic capacity of the poor to be more productive. So if you can remove inefficient subsidies or inefficient spending and put it into human capital investment, health, education, infrastructure that connects people to markets, that could have a structurally more sustainable impact on poverty reduction instead of just relying on transfers.
Thank you. I'm Talat Anwar from I'm Talat Anwar from School of Economics, Bahauddin Zakariya University. I think it's an excellent presentation by you. And you, in the final slides, I think you have presented a framework of elite bargain, citizen engagement, and international factors that shape the development outcome in developing countries. This is a very important framework that is given in the World Bank report of governance and law in 2017, probably, I remember. And I think one of the implication of this framework is that we did not have any chance because of the elite bargain. Chance of election recently, election has been delayed for various reasons. But because of the international actors, we have got the announcement of election. It is inherently written in the IMF program that election should be held. It is probably one of the conditions of the IMF program. So this is how international actors affect the development outcome in developing countries, particularly in Pakistan. This is a recent example. Can you cite other examples, where this framework has been relevant or implemented? Okay. Do you have another example?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a bit of a longer story, but in certain, very different, but in certain fragile contexts, the role of international actors is very important in trying to reach agreements for election. I mean, you have potentially an election coming in December in DRC, for example, right? And that has been mainly through that. There's one chapter in the report that we call the role of law, not the rule of law, but the role of law. One of them is the law should be an instrument for contestation that leads to contestability in the political market and so on. Sometimes the international conventions, for example, can be instruments, alternative instruments of contestation in the local political arena, right? And we can have examples of that in terms of human rights conventions, in terms of political conventions, and so on. So basically, the idea is that I would insist on the most, the essential aspect in which the international actors or factors are instruments to rely on, but at the end, the change only happens when there are new agreements among domestic actors. Agreements that have been only, and we have examples of constitutions written in Washington and imposed to a country that can be shown not to have been shown not to work. Right? At the end, governance is a very context-specific aspect, and international actors, factors, is different instruments that the global community has to try to again bring about positive change. But at the end, it's only about agreements among local actors. That might be a bit abstract, but there are many examples of human rights conventions, International Court of Justice, political agreements that help balance the power in domestic contexts and lead to better outcomes.
We can have only one question more. Doctor, please.
My name is Dr. Ashfaq. Excellent presentation, no doubt about this. I noted that you emphasized a lot on growth and its relationship with poverty alleviation, social equity, and so on. In a developing country like Pakistan, do you think that a country like Pakistan sustain high growth rate in a regime of over 20% interest rate? Can this be achieved in the foreseeable future with this high interest rate environment? Because I have showed in one of my table, that today, as we speak, our net federal receipts revenue is even less than the interest payment. So there is nothing left for all what you have said to spend here and there. So my question is very straight: can Pakistan sustain a growth rate which will provide all these results, as you have pointed out, with such a high interest rate environment? Second question is related to social protection, Benazir Income Support Program. 80% of the budget, 460 billion this year, goes for unconditional support. This is just like a helicopter money. Dropping money from the helicopter on the houses of the people and say that poverty will be reduced or whatever. Is it possible with such a huge amount of resources are simply distributed and that will have a positive impact on poverty alleviation?
Thank you. There are many things that will be a long answer, but let me simplify. First, one of the structural aspects for low growth that was presented, not the only one, but one of them, is the very low level of investment, and actually falling level of
What is the root cause?
Well, this involves private and public investment. That when you start from in a very distorted level, very low level, they can be actually complementary. That could be linked to the idea that there is no fiscal space to invest in productive capacity.
This is my whole question.
And I would
that
go
how
back to
can
my
you have
idea.
a fiscal space available in such a high interest rate environment?
So that is why I mentioned the idea of the very low level of tax collection. So it's a vicious cycle of very limited fiscal space, very low capacity to invest in productive infrastructure and attract, then increase the profitability of private investment, and create the condition for private investment, which is the only engine of long-term growth. The only engine of long-term growth is private sector investment, right? But that also is limited by what we show about the very low level of human capital. So the human capital index is at the level of sub-Saharan Africa. So any marginal space in terms of fiscal space could be used to invest in infrastructure and human capital investment. Now, I go to the question in terms of transfers. So in the context in a context of emergency, it makes sense to use transfers because it's about assistance. The question is that should not be instead of or at the cost of making these other adjustments in structural foundations of long-term growth. So final point is the interest rates and so on. And this is not only for Pakistan. It's very difficult to jumpstart the process of growth in such a distorted situation. You know, inflation that distorts relative prices. Relative prices, durables versus non-durables. The relative price of today versus tomorrow, which is the interest rate, completely distorted. It's like a dashboard in a car, right? If you are not getting the right signals, you are not going to make decisions. And also the relative price of external versus domestic products, which is the exchange rate. So if these basic relative prices are distorted, it's very difficult that economic agents will be making the right decisions. So we cannot overemphasize the importance of bringing the macro to a level of stability where these three signals recover information that is what the economic agents need to make decisions that can lead to growth.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Calva.
Standard answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now have to start the next session. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Thanks.